This podcast is brought to you in part by Sing & Dog Double Reed Supplies. Sing & Dog Double Reeds is an online double reed shop and one of the largest suppliers of high-quality and affordable professional and student reeds for oboe and bassoon in the USA. Please visit www.singanddog.com to see all of their products. That's SINGINDOG.com.
This episode is sponsored in part by MKL Reeds. MKL is the one-stop shop for handmade oboe reeds where you can try reeds from various makers and select the one that is best for you. Visit mklreeds.com and enter coupon code DOUBLEREEDDISH for free shipping on your first order. That's coupon code DOUBLE_REED_DISH, all caps, for free shipping on your first order.
Hi, I'm Galit Kaunitz.
And I'm Jackie Wilson, and you're listening to Double Reed Dish,
a podcast for oboists, bassoonists,
and the people who love them. Hey Galit, it's episode 6.
Hey Jackie, how's it going?
It's going very well. I'm feeling a lot more relaxed this week because my recital was last week, so I'm very happy to have that off of my plate.
I'm sending you a virtual high five.
Well, it was kind of strategically chosen. We book our dates a year in advance, and I thought, that'll be super nice to have that done nice and early and get it out of the way. And I'm so happy that I thought ahead that much because we've very quickly got a double read day coming up, and yeah, a lot to look forward to and happy to have that done. I was really happy with how it went, and yeah, it was cool.
That sounds awesome. And I heard a couple of your recordings from your recital that you posted, and you sound amazing.
Thank you very much. I had some awesome collaborators. The concept of the recital was dance. That was my theme on how I picked my repertoire. And so I played these Kachina dances by a Native American composer, Lewis Ballard, that I had been wanting to play for a while. And then I did a transcription of the Piazzolla Grand Tango, which nearly killed me, but I got through it. I was like, oh my gosh, what made me choose this? I have no time to breathe. It's so hard. I am not a cello, but I got through it. And then one kind of really cool thing I fell in love with and really wanted to play the Jenny Brandon Colored Stones.
I love her music so much.
She's fantastic, and I was really excited to play this piece, but I was like, this doesn't go with dance at all. It's an unaccompanied piece called Colored Stones. But we have this really great department of dance here where I work, and so I went to one of the dance faculty and said, hey, could we maybe put some choreography with this? And she was like, that'd be awesome. And so there are a bunch of students who needed to do kind of a capstone project, and so we collaborated on that, and it was super cool to present this kind of capital A art collaborative between music and dance. And yes, glad it happened, glad it went well, and glad it's over. What's going on with you there in Mississippi?
Oh, things are good. This weekend I got to play Beethoven 5, which is, I don't know, Beethoven is, it's hard to choose favorites, but I really think he's my favorite. I mean, it just gets me so fired up every time. Even Beethoven 5, which is like the most played, but that last movement makes me want to, rampage across the fjords or something. Yeah, it was a lot of fun. And we're back this week, and we have the All-South Honor Band here at Southern Miss this weekend, which is great. I'm going to meet 14 high school oboists, which is...
Oh my gosh.
So great. I know. I can't wait. I'm really excited.
It's a lot of oboe.
It's a lot of oboe. And we have our Prism concert this weekend, which is... Have you ever been to a Prism concert?
A prison concert?
A Prism concert.
Oh, no. What's a Prism concert?
I have to say a prison concert is also a really good idea, but this is different. So it's like a musical potpourri, basically. Like you just have a bunch of different ensembles located in different parts of the auditorium, and the spotlight shines on one ensemble, they play their thing, and then it goes to another ensemble, they play their thing, and it's like really pretty casual and unpredictable and fun. The whole thing is really fun.
Well, next time you can do the Cell Block Tango from Chicago and do a Prism concert. Yuck, yuck,
What?
yuck.
It's happening. What we are doing, and I know you're going to be so excited about it, is one of our bassoon music education students, Jonathan, wrote an arrangement of some Beyonce songs for double reed ensemble. So we are doing that.
I am sending Jonathan some virtual praise hand emojis for his Beyonce arrangements.
Yeah, he killed it. It's really fun. And there is some choreography, so I'm really proud of it. And I think it's going to be the icing on it's not the icing on the cake. It's going to be the main event. Let's be real.
That sounds phenomenal. I wish I could be there.
I wish you could be here too. We could do the choreography together.
Sure. Well, we've got some kind of exciting news for our listeners. We had this kind of fun idea that we would do a giveaway contest. So why don't you tell our listeners about what is up for grabs in our contest?
So some of our awesome sponsors have donated some things, and then we've donated some things. So for prizes, we have 2 free pieces of your choice from JDW Sheet Music, Janet Ingles' CD called Music That Should Have Been Written for the Oboe, which I have heard and sounds awesome, a spool of neon green Rigatti nylon FF thread, and a tube of Dr. Slick organic cork grease.
So this is a prize package, which is valued at over $50. So I know our listeners are thinking, how do I get that? How do I win this contest? And it's very simple. So this podcast you're listening to is being released on February 15th. And we, along with the posting of this episode, are going to post on all of our social media, Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, a thread for the giveaway. And under that giveaway post, we want you to answer the question, which oboist or bassoonist would you love to have us interview on an upcoming episode? Now, we can't make any promises that this person will come on, but we want to get some feedback and see what direction you guys want us to take. So anyone who comments is going to be automatically entered into a drawing. And on February 23rd, we will announce the winner and who gets all these awesome prizes. So you can comment anytime between now and February 22nd.
And if you're an international listener, don't cry because you're included too.
Yes, we will ship anywhere. You don't need to worry about that international shipping. We want to hear from you as well. So for our shout outs this week, we are going to collaborate, but we still have 2 for you. And our first is Erin Off's YouTube channel. So Erin is the bassoon teacher at Jacksonville State University, and her YouTube channel has a variety of videos, instructional, overview, hilarious, to address all things bassoon and even double reed. There are some oboe and English horn things on here as well. And one of my favorite videos I have a clip up here for is the scary bassoon that she did for Halloween. She found this old bassoon that lacked all of the keys and was just this kind of Frankenstein, what's going on, like the kind of bassoon you see when you teach double reed tech.
And then all you hear is the Psycho theme.
Yes. Exactly. So she takes us through the scariest bassoon she can find, and it's pretty bad. I was like, I thought I saw some cray bassoons, and she found the craziest. So
she's so brave.
Yes. But there's a ton of stuff on here. The thing I really like about it is she does product reviews and product comparisons. You know, we play expensive instruments, and so I was just really happy to see these videos that say compare bassoon cases or bassoons for under $5,000 so that you can be an educated consumer. And I think that's a unique thing that these videos have to offer.
Yeah, and she's honest, too. She's not just like, oh, all of this is wonderful.
Yeah, she definitely brings a critical lens and a professional opinion. So check out Erin Oft. That's ERYNOFT. And if you just put that into the YouTube search engine, she will come right up, and you'll be glad you did.
Yeah, and her picture on the YouTube, her picture for her YouTube channel is super fly.
As a bassoonist, you're probably already familiar that the whisper key usually depresses a button on the vocal, making low notes easier to happen. On this instrument, the whisper key is simply a button. A button that does not attach anywhere. Now, unfortunately for me, when I bought this bassoon, it did not have a vocal with it.
So our second shout out is a CD called The Singing Oboe. And the oboist on the CD is Andrew Parker, who teaches oboe at the University of Texas at Austin, and he collaborates with Alan Huckleberry from the University of Iowa on piano. It's called The Singing Oboe, and it is romantic German lead transcriptions. Jackie, do you want to talk a little bit about the different pieces that he includes on here?
Yeah, the big piece on here is that he does the entire Dichterliebe by Robert Schumann, and then he's also got several Schubert songs, Gretchen at the Spinning Wheel, and then also Beethoven's Adelaide. I own this CD personally, and I love it. I think one of the things that I love so much about Andrew Parker's playing is how vocal it is. And so when he applies his beautiful playing to these vocal works and these wonderful romantic melodies, it's just heavenly. It's wonderful. I can't recommend it highly enough.
And this is something that, you know, even pedagogically, like I'm always trying to tell my students, be more vocal, be more operatic, be more like a singer, try to do what they would do. What would they do? Do it. And it's awesome that now we can point to, you know, an actual CD of vocal transcriptions and be like, see, he did it, do it.
Yeah, definitely. So with his permission, we are going to include a little bit of one of the tracks from Dichterliebe. This is for my German-speaking listeners and friends, and especially our German audience, of which we do have some. Please forgive my pronunciation. We spent several minutes before starting to record deciding how I can give this my best attempt, but Im wunderschönen Monat Mai. Did I do okay, Galit?
I think it was pretty close, but still, we're very sorry.
We're sorry, yes. So enjoy better playing than my pronunciation.
Janet Ingle loves the oboe. She has built her reputation on providing high-quality handmade reeds, education, and a sympathetic ear to oboists across the country. When you order from Janet Ingle Reeds, you get prompt communication, reeds or cane handcrafted to your specifications, and cheerful, friendly customer service. All orders are mailed within 1 week, often much faster. Monthly reed subscriptions are available, as well as single orders, and on the site you can also find reed cases, tools, and supplies. Janet's own sheet music arrangements and her new CD, Music That Should Have Been Written for the Oboe.
One thing that I love about Jenna Engel's site is this offering of monthly read subscriptions, which I think is a really awesome and unique offering of this company. Being able to depend on having your reads shipped and arrived to you when you need them is so crucial, as we know. And I really compel our listeners to go to her website and her Facebook page, where you can see high quality up close photos of these phenomenal reads, so you know the quality of the reads that you're purchasing. And I highly recommend Janet Engel Reads. This episode is brought to you in part by JDW Sheet Music. JDW Sheet Music is an online store that specializes in original chamber music pieces for wind instruments. The website offers a variety of music transcriptions of composers like Debussy, Bach, Piazzolla, and Rachmaninoff. Owner and arranger Jessica Wilkins has produced over 60 chamber music arrangements featuring oboe and bassoon. Jessica's works have been performed at colleges across the country, as well as the 2015 IDRS conference in Tokyo, Japan. For access to the entire JDW Sheet Music catalog, please visit jdwsheetmusic.com.
In looking at her catalog, it really is extensive. She's got things for all sorts of double reed combinations, and she does custom transcriptions. And on her website, she lists all of these really cool ensembles and oboe studios that she's done transcriptions for. And there's really nothing better than having somebody compose/transcribe for your instrument who understands your instrument. So it's a really cool service that she offers, and I would highly recommend JDW Sheet Music.
So continuing on with Mentor Month, this episode we welcome Eric Ohlsson, professor of oboe at Florida State University, and your mentor, Galit. Why don't you introduce us to Dr. Ohlsson?
Well, suffice to say, I'm such a huge super fan of Dr. Eric Ohlsson. I studied with him in my doctorate, and in my opinion, he's one of the best teachers and performers out there. He's got such a gorgeous sound. He plays principal oboe in the Palm Beach Opera and Tallahassee Symphony, and he teaches at the Brevard Music Center in North Carolina as a summer festival. And he's just one of the most chill, easygoing, wonderful human beings I've ever met. And when I was studying with him, I was really I know this will be surprising for you, Jackie, but I was really kind of an anxious head case. And his relaxed attitude about everything totally helped me chill out, and just, whenever I was really stressed out about something, he would be like, well, practice more. And I was like, what do you mean practice more? He was like, well, just practice more. If you practice more, it'll get better. And I was like, oh, okay. So then I would practice more and it would get better, and then my anxiety would go away, and it was magic.
It's good advice.
Yeah, it's really good advice. And he's got really good ideas about music and life, and he's, still one of my mentors. Like you were saying with Benjamin Coelho, you call him with big decisions, and I also call Eric with big decisions, and I can't say enough good things about him. So I'm really excited to introduce our listeners to Dr. Eric Ohlsson.
Welcome to the podcast, Eric Ohlsson from Florida State. We're so glad to have you. Thank you for coming on.
Well, thank you for having me.
Could you start off by telling our listeners a bit about how you started playing the oboe, and if you had anyone in particular who encouraged you along your way?
Well, I'd be happy to. I started a little bit late, I guess, but when I was in elementary school, I started on the clarinet when I was 8 at the time, and I played the clarinet until I was starting high school, and then I switched to the oboe. But during the time I was in elementary school, my parents were both professional musicians, so we sort of had mandatory concert attendance in our house. it was never about homework. It was always go practice. So, that's a pretty good situation for a kid who wants to have music as something they do well later on in life. To have parents that encourage practicing above anything else, really, I think was a big help. But I was fortunate to have some really good models even back before I started playing. I lived in Cedar Rapids, Iowa, and there was a gentleman that played in the Cedar Rapids Symphony of all places. And he's an IDRS member. He's still around. His name is Ted Hager. And he was, really inspirational for me to listen to when I was just a kid, And, so I wanted to play that instrument. That was the sound that I heard, and that's the sound that I wanted to make, So he was a Tabito student. He was one of Tabito's last students, I think. And I've only talked to Ted once, I think, in my entire life, but I did tell him and give him credit for my having started to play the oboe. So basically, then when you've started on another instrument and you're involved in band and things like that, it's a little bit hard to switch. But when I started high school, I just decided to make a break from that, and I quit playing in the band. Sorry, band directors. I quit playing in the band and started practicing the oboe. And I was lucky. I lived in a little town called Nacogdoches in Texas. You know where that is, Khalid. And my first teacher was on the faculty there at Stephen F. Austin University, and his name was Travis Cox. And he was a dedicated and fine teacher. He spent a lot of time with me, and my first lesson consisted of me making my first sounds on the oboe, which were not very sweet, as you might imagine. But once I got the hang of it, how much air it took to make it start, I was in pretty good shape. And then he taught me to play a G major scale. And it was just all very, very, very low tech back then. It was the mid 60s, and so he just wrote out the scale. I knew how to read music, of course. He just wrote out the fingerings on a piece of paper and gave it to me and said, "Here, go play this as much as you can stand for the next week and come back." And then, before I could get out the door, he said, "Okay, now we're going to make an oboe read." And remember, this was my first lesson. Okay. So you see what I mean about the first ever lesson was the first ever read.
Wow.
And man, that is dedication. I don't know how long we sat there. Because my best friend and I both started the oboe together. That was a big help too. His name was Wake Foster. I think he's no longer living. But that was also a big help, to have a close friend that was kind of pushing me along too. So we'd go to our lessons basically at the same time, and then we made reads together, the three of us. And we must have been there for a couple of hours. You imagine teaching an 8th grader and a 9th grader how to rap a reed. You know what that's like. It's a lot of cane flying across the room and stuff like that. And you just have no clue what you're doing, and you just sort of go along with it. And the reed worked, and there I was, I was off and running, and I bought reed supplies from a guy named Marcel Dandois. So these are really links to the past. He was one of the old French guys that came over and played in the Cincinnati Symphony. He and Albert Andreau.
Wow.
Were in the Cincinnati Symphony, and it was really cool, He just had this private little business. He'd send me extra cane, and he'd write me a letter, and say, "Here's some extra pieces for you to wrap." It's a completely different kind of vibe back then. You couldn't dial up RDG and get your super super duper shaped cane of superior quality, over the internet or over the telephone. Just, it was great though. It was, very nice. And he was in Dallas at the time, so it was close. So that was the beginning of it. And then, my family moved after that year, and I didn't have a teacher an oboe teacher for several years. I studied with some really talented people. One was a clarinetist and one was a flutist. So it's not quite the same, even though, their directions were very good and they taught me other things. I studied a lot of chamber music with the clarinetist because he had been a pretty well-known freelancer in New York City back in the freelancing heyday of New York City. And he was a friend of Henry Schumann and Harry Schulman. Probably know those names, very famous guys from back then. So that was a big help. And then when I was a freshman in college, I took private lessons from James Caldwell. And the next year, then I had a teacher at my school. His name was Ben Wright. And he was good also. He was, I think all of my teachers have been very good at one thing or another. And Ben was just, very good at nuts and bolts kind of teacher, Sellner etudes and things like that. Learn the Haydn concerto, learn a few excerpts. So it was fine for me. And I had a lot of experience in my undergrad. I went to James Madison, and it wasn't a very big music department at the time, but I played a lot. And that made up for some of the things that I didn't get from fellow students, because I was always the best one, and there were only 4 or 5 of us probably. And, so I played first chair and everything. But I did start playing I played in the Roanoke Symphony in college. I played in the Lynchburg Symphony in college. I was always pretty good at kind of getting out there and getting gigs for myself. And it's not rocket science. I mean, it's a few phone calls and showing up can do a lot for somebody's career, at least for somebody's playing experience, which is part of your career. So when you go after grad school, you've actually played in some orchestras and you've played some repertoire. I see a lot of people today that went to a lot better schools than I did, that when they come, say, to Brevard for study in the summer and we sit down together to play a Beethoven symphony in the big orchestra, they've never played a Beethoven symphony before in their lives. And they're in their early 20s. So, I mean, there are certain advantages and disadvantages to each way. And at this point, I don't think I would change anything about it. And I went to grad school at Ohio State. I studied with Bill Baker. He was excellent for me. He really did as much to encourage me as anybody had ever done. And, was a big class of students there. Laura Albeck was in that class. James Brody, who teaches at the University of Colorado, he was in that class. James Prodan, who was a really great oboe player. I think Jim's retired now, but he was for a long time he was the archivist of for IDRS. So some pretty significant people, that later became professionals were in the same class, and that was really good for me. And then after I was there for a year or two, I started going up to Cleveland and taking private lessons from John Mack. And that was, another level for me. So, all those people, I would say, had a tremendous influence on me and encouraged me. Both,
Can you tell us a little bit more about what you learned from John Mack? He was just such a huge figure in the oboe world. I'd love to hear more about, your studies with him.
Well, I guess to start with, he just scared the devil out of me. And, there's something to that, for just immediately upping your game. You're you're paying attention on a different level when you're talking to somebody you've always heard about but never knew, never really spoke to, until you get up the courage to call them up on the telephone. And probably everybody that ever took lessons from him can still remember his phone number, But he always seemed to be able to give me advice and admonishment or encouragement in such a way that it lasted me forever. And he always seemed to be able to say something with a minimum amount of confusion and with maybe even the right sort of emotional or psychological edge to it that would either make it more palatable or more memorable without killing me, So when he said something, he would just expect you to do that. And then he would tell you in enough different ways that you could get it. He had an endless supply, as you know, of anecdotes and comparisons and analogies that were really, really entertaining and thought-provoking and got right to the point, He also, I think that I developed, of course, some of this happens over time too, but he was speaking on a musical level that I didn't really comprehend. I don't know if you had that experience with him.
Yeah, definitely.
But many things that he said to me, I had to remember because I had no clue what he was saying.
Yeah, I have little notes in my Barrett articulation studies that years later I look back and I say, oh, that's what he was talking about.
Exactly. Mm-hmm. So I was a pretty good student, and I would take careful notes when my lesson was over, so that I wouldn't forget what I'd learned. I think Stevens Hewitt said in you've seen his Stevens Hewitt method book, where he says something about the lightest pencil marking is stronger than your best memory. And that's sort of true. Once you write it down by hand, you remember it. Mm-hmm. You remember it a lot better than you would just, keeping it in your head. So learning things about inflection and direction, different ways of expressing the exact same thing, making your music sound imaginative and spontaneous while doing it exactly the same way you'd done it 5 minutes ago. That was a big thing with him. He taught me to cover my tone. He taught me some things about voicing. He honestly taught me a lot of really important things that he didn't have any recollection of having said to me years later. Because I'd ask him a question like, well, when you voice a note to try to make it have more focus, do you do X, Y, or Z with your tongue or things like that? And he's like, I don't know, not necessarily. But I did have Philadelphia influence as well. I auditioned for Curtis when I was going to college, and I really wanted to study with Delancey. And at the time, he was about the only person that I knew. He was the most recorded American oboe player, probably around the late '60s or early '70s. All those Philadelphia first chair things and the recording with the flower clock, all those things. So his name and reputation really stood out to me also. I did have that influence as well. So I'm not particularly all dialed into just one studio of playing. I admire many, many different kinds of oboe playing.
We had recently a listener write in and share an embarrassing story about a tuning A, and we discussed kind of the anxiety of playing principal oboe.
Uh-huh.
And you are the principal oboist at the Brevard Music Center in North Carolina, as well as the Tallahassee Symphony and the Palm Beach Opera. And I wondered if you could talk to us about good principal oboe playing and how you go about that specific role.
Well, that's quite a question. I think you have to be consistent. I think you must have a good tone, and you must be flexible with your tone and your phrasing. But I think that people are most attracted, first off, to your sound, you know. And as a principal oboist, you have to give a good A, a solid A, the same A every time. Maybe there's a certain amount of attitude that comes with it. If you can have a little swagger in your playing and be a good person, I think that's a good idea, you know. I practiced so much before I would go to rehearsal, you know. And I think that, you know, even when I hadn't had quite as much experience, I think everybody could tell that I was trying, that I was learning, that I was doing something, you know. So, you know, there are certain things that you do that make people respect you, and one is being prepared. The other is working hard enough so you can sound beautiful on a daily basis. It's sort of like, sounds kind of cliche, but it's sort of like climbing the ladder of oboe playing, meaning you can't just practice and you can't just make reeds, and maybe you can't do even, you know, trading off days doing that. You climb a ladder with both of your feet and both of your hands, and it's pretty hard to do it otherwise. So if you're constantly on the lookout where you're going up those steps and you're changing levels in each area, but you're constantly trying to catch up with whichever one is falling farther behind. And I think usually it's the reeds. You know, often players can think of what they want to say, but they can't say it because they just don't have a voice that works for them. Mm-hmm. So I think that's really important. I think having extremely good models is really important too. I think that you're going to sound more like the people whose playing you adore and that you listen to. I don't know if I imagine that people do as much listening today as I did when I was a kid. But so modeling, I think that, you know, if you have a good ear, first of all, you have to have a good ear. You have to have a really good ear and a certain amount of courage. There are lots of ways that people get courage. You can naturally have courage. You can prepare yourself and have more courage that way. Other people encouraging you helps you do that. But I think those two elements are really strong. But back to the hearing part of it, you know, if you have a basically good ear, you're going to imitate the sounds that you hear most often. So, you know, I would try to surround myself with playing like Max or Robert Bloom or John Delancey people like that, and Ray Still, who were in the Gombergs, people that were in the big orchestras back in the 60s and early 70s that I knew. And of course, Woodhams had started playing professionally then too, so he was a big influence too. But I credit that for, giving me an idea what it was supposed to be like. So I could get closer to it on my own that way. And then your teacher guides you to that, and your reads guide you to that. So again, it's about climbing those steps.
I love that thing you said about the easy way to make people respect you is by being prepared. I feel like I want to get that on a cross stitch and hang it on my wall. That's genius.
Plus, just kind of basic things that make you a good person. Being willing to change, being flexible, being kind, although, still being able to stand up for yourself. There's nothing wrong with that. But there are ways to do those sorts of things. You can kind of stay out of any crossfire that might develop from conductors or concert masters or personnel managers and people like that. You can do all that stuff and still just sort of keep the blinders on and keep moving forward so you don't get distracted.
So changing gears just a little bit, I am, of course, very biased, but you've had a very long and successful career at Florida State, and many of your students go on to have wonderful teaching and performing careers. Mm-hmm. Can you talk to us a little bit about your approach to teaching and what you've learned over your career?
Sure. I'm humbled by, being able to teach all these people. And I think you have to go into it with a certain amount of humility when you start teaching, while at the same time, you have to have something to offer, but there's so much that you don't know. It's always on your mind, like that you don't know everything. Mm-hmm. So you're teaching and experimenting and trying things. And I never really thought of myself as the last word on anything, having to do with anything really. But, I think that I have passed along some good information to my students. And I've really tried to do it in a way that I was taught, So I think I owe a lot of what I can do as a teacher to all of my teachers, because I think every single one of them had really good things to say. And so when you sit down on a lesson for the first time, it's quite a shock, I was really lucky to get to teach a lot early on. I taught some students when I was in college, and of course I'd always talk to my friends that studied where I was, in Virginia. And then when I went to graduate school, right away, Bill Baker, sort of channeled some teaching gigs my way, because he certainly couldn't do everything himself. And, so I taught at places like Denison University and Otterbein College when I was living in Columbus. So I had these teaching jobs. I had about 4 students at Denison, and I think I had 2 students at Otterbein. So for a beginning teacher, that's a nice amount of responsibility. It's not overwhelming. And a lot of the things that we're telling our students, a lot of things that young teachers can do are basic things. Play scales, play arpeggios, play etudes and things like that. Think about your accuracy, your pitch, your tone. I guess it's all about basics in the end. Mm-hmm. That's what really great players practice. They practice fundamental things so that they are able to do the more difficult things. Because without those basics, they wouldn't they wouldn't have traveled to the point where it's going to sound great, you know?
Mm-hmm.
So once you get the basic things down, maintaining that is major responsibility. I think I've learned to accumulate fundamental knowledge to pass on to my students. And so from those fundamentals, I try to get my students to practice and play inclusively to make a more cohesive and sharper image of what they're presenting in the music. So if you practice the notes once and then you practice the rhythms and then you practice the intonation, nothing's ever going to come out inclusively. So if we can sort of take the commotion out of the project and boil it down to perhaps a slower passage or doing it more slowly or doing it in smaller chunks that we can practice inclusively. And although it may take longer to do that, you're going to end up with a better product. So when we can practice inclusively, we are going to get closer to the composer's objectives and then beyond that to play to our full potential. So practicing inclusively, we get a certain amount of direction from the composer. And so if we do what the composer has put on the page, we get maybe half of what could be made of that music. So it is our individual practicing of fundamental elements of music that will allow us to play to our full potential. And then we fill in the gap of the other 50%. I think that's a very unscientific way of looking at it, but it makes sense to me.
And it keeps it from being boring too, because
Right.
we should be doing everything possible to keep the music from being just a boring, literal interpretation.
That's right. And it's hard to do all the things we need to do at the same time. Very hard. So it takes more patience than most people have. The practicers are going to rule the world, you know.
I
people
agree.
who just sit there and do it.
Well, my question was going to be what advice you would give for a young oboist who aspires for a career like yours, but I feel like you're giving such wonderful advice in that previous answer that maybe we could ask you to give specific reed-making advice for the young oboist who aspires to have a career like yours.
By stock in Legere.
Or a 3D printer or something.
Yeah, right. Again, you know, I think you almost have to have a teacher. I mean, you have to have a teacher. Some people are pretty crafty with their reed making, you know. There are people who have learned to make pretty darn good reeds without very much direction. But boy, oh boy, I mean, that first lesson sort of sealed it for me. That, you know, there's no substitute for having a professional of good quality showing you what to do right from the beginning. So I didn't really have any, I didn't have nearly as many questions about reeds as I would have had if that had been a mystery to me for a couple of years. So I would say, you know, as soon as you can make reeds without hurting yourself, you should start making reeds. If you get some of the fundamental things down, and I couldn't really make my own reeds to play concerts on for a year or something like that. Although, you know, I played my first reed, but it was an odd feeling after my first year. I was sort of, you know, I didn't have an oboe teacher. There was a girl that went to James Madison who was a pretty good reed maker, and she would make reeds for me. But then by the time I was a junior in high school, she was gone, and I still didn't have an oboe teacher, so I'd just make my own reeds, you know, and that was that. And scrape until they made sound, and I knew how to do those basic things already. And I knew how to wrap them, I knew how to scrape a little bit, I knew how to clip them into tune and stuff like that. So, you know, I went to all-state band and things like that when I was a junior in high school. And I didn't really know that much about reed making, but I made all my own reeds. And the guy who was in all-state with me was Jim Ryan, who
Wow.
teaches Texas. And he was from the big city, you know, he was from D.C. So he had he had these oboe teachers. I mean, I was just like, my jaw just fell open, listening to Jim play when he was a senior in high school. I just couldn't believe it. He was really good. He was amazing. I didn't have that kind of background yet at that point, And I don't really know that my background really quite fit into any mold like that, Yale Juilliard or Cleveland Juilliard or anything like that, ever. So it doesn't have to be like that. Certainly an advantage. But so advice for young oboe players, get a teacher. Find the best teacher you can find, whether they're down the block or 100 miles away, and go take lessons from that guy or woman. And, they'll put you on the right path probably. I think we have a pretty high level of knowledge in the oboe community about making reeds. So there are a lot of people who can really positively affect a young person's reed making. And I think also, if you're situated in a way that you can do it, your friends will teach you a lot about reed making. Later on, when I think I was in graduate school, and I played in this summer festival with Fred Corman and Peggy Michael, and it was this American Symphony Orchestra League festival in Orkney Springs, Virginia. This completely charming, falling down, broken down, old Civil War era hotel back in the sticks in Virginia, up against the mountains. You can go over the mountain next to this old resort, and you were in West Virginia. So it was sort of the western Shenandoah Valley, And like those guys taught me a lot about reed making, especially Fred. I think Peggy and I both went to Fred Corman for advice on reed making. I was about 21 or something, and he was almost 30, I think. So, he really knew a lot. I mean, he had this huge background. He was playing professionally, and he sounded like a god, And so, that was really great to actually sit every day with somebody who could play like that. And he was actually a very strong influence on my tone as well. But those kinds of collegial relationships mean a lot to all of us, I think.
Mm-hmm. So we all wish that we had more practice time. Mm-hmm. How do you make the most of the practice time that you do get?
I think that you gain efficiency as you get a little bit older, because the rest of our lives tend to take off in different directions. We have, life partners and children and things like that you can't even imagine earlier on having had those kinds of distractions around you. Is we're more or less, early on are able to just go about, do our practicing whenever the heck we want to. So I think you have to, again, you practice the fundamentals. You practice what got you to that point in the first place. And there is a list of things that you could probably say in your own playing, okay, this exercise works for me, and I've really seen it make me better. So once you get that, you tend to hang on to that thing, like long tones, for example. I never really talked about long tones with anybody. People would talk about, especially the Philadelphia people, like Caldwell taught me this exercise, this horrible, evil exercise where you do 1 to 9 to 1. And you start on low D and make a fabulous crescendo up to an octave E diminuendo for 8 counts and back to 1 on the low D and hold that D, so you didn't just, just go down and smack it and stop. So it had to be a controlled diminuendo with a graceful ending where you, so it sounded like you intended to end it there, in beginnings that sounded like you intended to start then, not the third or fourth time your tone slapped against the reed, but the very first time when that tone would just like appear out of the mist, that was hard to do. Man, that was really hard to do. But so that was my example of long tones, and I still use that exercise with my students. And I know, Caldwell's many great students have heard of that exercise. He had a lot of fabulous students. So then at a certain point I thought, well, I don't think my endurance is good enough. So I started playing more long tones and started, sort of clocking myself on long tones to see how long I could actually hold a note or an arpeggio or a series of notes, like in a scale. I think that was really beneficial to me, and so I kind of still do that on a daily basis. I think you're going to be more successful in your daily playing if you can begin with one note that sounds good. So starting with long tones is a great way to practice inclusively and have an easier result. You're playing a long tone. Say you just want to play mezzo forte with a beautiful tone. I think that's a fair starting place. Not nearly as daunting as starting at piano, but say starting that note mezzo forte like the flute players do with their Moise exercises. They'll play ya-dum, dee-da-dum, and just increasingly more notes, but each one held for a fairly long time. Mm-hmm. They hear the first note. You play the first note. Is there anything I can do to make that one note sound better? And these calculations can come very quickly. You repeat it, try to do that. Play it again. You are free to use your imagination on what might be better. Usually it's air or embouchure. But one of those two elements, a correction in one way or another, like, using more of the, Mac used to call them the Fu Manchu muscles, the Yosemite Sam muscles, using more direction from there, or using a more quality airstream. For example, there are a lot of times when you think to yourself, if I used 25% more air intensity on that note, but I didn't play any louder, would that make it better? And it almost always does. Of course, unless you're going for the complete opposite effect, unless you want something to sound very ethereal and distant. You'd still be supporting a lot, though. Sometimes the quietest notes have the most fiery support. I like to have a good time in teaching and playing too. I like to be myself. And I can be kind of goofy sometimes, and I enjoy that too. I think humor goes a long way to making a person more human.
Totally.
And they see that you are serious about what you do, but you don't take yourself too seriously.
I wonder if you could tell us about a favorite memory of a past performance that you have.
I think my senior recital in college was a big milestone for me because it was the first time I played a recital and I memorized it. And this was the first playing I'd done as a serious oboe player. So yeah, that senior recital was a big thing for me because I actually stood up there and played a whole recital from memory and didn't freak out. And, that was a real milestone for me. And I think I really started to practice seriously when I was a senior in college. So I think that was an important one for me. I've had lots of concerts, the concerts where I thought I did a really good job every once in a while. Those stand out to me. And, your continuous playing, maybe the most meaningful one is the last one that you really thought you did a good job on. Mm-hmm. Because that's the one that really matters, right? I mean, all of them matter to me, but, the people that listen to us play don't really care if you had a good senior recital. They probably think, they probably don't think about that, They just see the finished product, they don't see the steps involved. that you or I would see in each other, you know. So we did I really enjoyed playing the Alpine Symphony last summer. That was a good one to me. Playing the Strauss Concerto for the first time, that's always a standout, you know. Mm-hmm. Or when you play the Mozart Concerto for the first time. And if we're lucky, we get to play all kinds of pieces like that. I've gotten to play a really good number of concerto performances with orchestra, you know, the Haydn, Strauss, Mozart, Martin, Vaughan Williams, Strauss a couple of times, Mozart several times, Haydn a bunch of times. So I think those are nice. But, you know, the occasional performance where you really feel like you're in control. There are a few times when you don't have to think about how you're playing the oboe, that you can, you know, basically sing the part and not be so aware of having that in your mouth or becoming so tired that you have to take a breath or something like that. Where you can actually be spontaneous under pressure. Those are memorable, I think.
Eric, thank you so much for being on Double Reed Dish. It was so wonderful to have you. And just as a final question, where can our listeners find you on the internet?
Well, I have one of my students put my CD on YouTube, so I think you can just type in my name, ERICOHLSSON, and you can find me there. On there is my CD and a few performances from Brevard and things like that. And also at fsu.edu, find me there.
Well, thank you so much. Again, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you. I enjoyed it.
Well, that's it for Mentor Month. Thank you so much for joining us and for allowing us to introduce you to some of the most special people in our lives.
Don't forget to subscribe on iTunes and SoundCloud, and also to follow us on Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, where you can participate in that giveaway, so don't forget to do that. Thank you to our sponsors, and thank you for listening. And if you want to get in touch, our email is doublereeddish@gmail.com.